Can't sleep? John Wick is here to help. But instead of bullets and bad guys, he's bringing soothing narration and the epic tale of his revenge to lull you into a peaceful slumber. Tired of boring bedtime stories? Experience the thrilling world of John Wick, but without the action, just the captivating narrative told in a relaxing tone, perfect for drifting off to dreamland. Fall asleep to the legendary story of John Wick. This video features the entire film's plot, but with calming narration and soothing music, making it the perfect way to relax and drift off to dreamland. In a world that moved too fast, there lived a man named John Wick, who had found something precious: peace. His days were no longer filled with the chaos that once defined him. Instead, they flowed like a gentle river, steady and calm. John's home was a sanctuary of white walls and warm wood, where sunlight streamed through large windows and cast dancing shadows on polished floors. Here in this haven, he shared his days with Helen, his beloved wife, whose laughter was like wind chimes in a summer breeze. Helen was everything John never knew he needed. Her presence filled the quiet spaces of his heart with warmth. She moved through their home like morning light, bringing life to every corner. Her smile could chase away the darkest memories, and her touch could still the restless storms that sometimes visited John's dreams. Together they built a life of simple pleasures. Weekend mornings spent reading newspapers in bed, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Evening walks through their neighborhood, hands intertwined watching the sun paint the sky in watercolor hues. They spoke in the comfortable silence of two souls who had found their home in each other. But their love story was not complete until a small bundle of joy arrived. A beagle puppy named Daisy. With her soft brown eyes and gentle spirit, Daisy became the third member of their perfect trinity. She would curl up between them on the couch during movie nights, her tiny body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. John, who had once lived in a world of shadows and steel, now found his greatest joy in the simple act of watching Daisy chase butterflies in their garden. Her playful barks replaced the echoes of his past, and her unconditional love helped heal wounds that time alone could not touch. Days melted into months and months into years. John had traded his former life for something infinitely more valuable: the chance to love and be loved without condition. He tended to his small garden, fixed things around the house, and learned that happiness could be found in the most ordinary moments. Helen would sometimes catch him standing at their bedroom window in the early morning light, simply watching the world wake up. "What are you thinking about?" she would ask, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "How lucky I am," he would always reply, leaning into her embrace. But even in the most beautiful gardens, winter must come. Helen began to feel tired more often, her vibrant energy slowly dimming like a candle burning low. The doctors spoke in gentle voices, using words that seemed to float in the air like autumn leaves. Words John wished he could catch and make disappear. As Helen grew weaker, their love grew stronger. John became her guardian, her protector in ways he had never been before. He held her hand through treatments, read to her when she was too tired to hold a book, and learned to braid her hair when she could no longer lift her arms. Daisy seemed to understand too. The little beagle would lie quietly beside Helen's bed, her warm body a comforting presence during the long, difficult nights. Sometimes John would find them both asleep, Helen's hand resting gently on Daisy's fur, both breathing softly in the afternoon light filtering through the curtain. On Helen's last day, the house was filled with a golden, peaceful light. She looked at John with eyes still bright with love and whispered words of comfort, not for herself but for him. "Promise me," she said, her voice soft as silk, "that you'll find a way to be happy again." John held her close, memorizing the feeling of her heartbeat against his chest. "I promise," he whispered back, though he couldn't imagine how such a thing would be possible. When Helen passed, it was like watching the sun set for the final time. The house that had been filled with laughter and love suddenly felt as vast and empty as an ocean. John sat in their bedroom, holding Daisy close, both of them mourning the absence of the woman who had been their whole world. 2 days after Helen's funeral, a delivery truck arrived at John's door. The driver, speaking in hushed, respectful tones, handed John a small wooden crate. Inside, nestled in soft blankets, was a tiny beagle puppy, smaller even than Daisy had been when she first arrived. There was a note written in Helen's familiar handwriting. "John, I know how much Daisy means to you, and I know how much you'll miss having someone to care for. This little one needs you as much as you need her. Her name is, well, that's for you to decide. Love you always, Helen." John sank to his knees, cradling the puppy against his chest. The little one looked up at him with trusting brown eyes, and for the first time since Helen's passing, John felt something other than emptiness. This tiny creature was Helen's final gift to him, a bridge between his grief and whatever lay ahead. He named her Daisy after the flowers Helen had loved to plant in their garden each spring. As the days passed, Daisy became John's anchor to the world. She needed to be fed, walked, played with. She gave structure to his shapeless days and purpose to his aimless hours. In the mornings, John would take Daisy to the park where he and Helen used to walk. The little dog would run ahead, then circle back to check on him as if she understood that he needed watching over too. People in the park would smile at the sight of the tall, quiet man and his energetic companion, never knowing the depth of love and loss that had brought them together. Evenings were the hardest time. John would sit in his chair with Daisy curled in his lap, both of them listening to the silence where Helen's voice used to be. But gradually, slowly, the silence became less sharp. Daisy's soft breathing, her tiny snores, her occasional dream whimpers began to fill the space with new sounds of life. John's peaceful existence was shattered on what should have been an ordinary day. He had taken his prized 1969 Mustang Boss 429 to a gas station, its engine purring like a contented cat. The car was more than metal and machinery to John. It was one of the last connections to his life with Helen, who had loved to ride with the windows down and music playing softly. At the station, a young man with expensive clothes and an entitled air approached John. The stranger's eyes lingered on the Mustang with obvious desire. "Nice car," he said, his voice carrying an edge that John recognized from his former life. "How much?" "It's not for sale," John replied quietly, his voice carrying the finality of stone. "But some people cannot hear no." The young man's face hardened with the petulant anger of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. What John didn't know was that this wasn't just any spoiled rich boy. This was Yusef Tarasov, son of Viggo Tarasov, a powerful figure in the Russian underworld. That night, John's house, his sanctuary, his refuge from the world, was violated. Men broke in while he slept, moving through his home like shadows. They struck him down in his own bedroom, the same room where he had held Helen in her final moments. But their cruelty didn't end with John. Little Daisy, who had barked bravely trying to protect her owner, was silenced forever. They took the Mustang and left behind only broken glass, violated space, and a grief so profound it threatened to drown John entirely. When John awakened on his kitchen floor, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet he had grown accustomed to, but the terrible absence of small paws clicking on hardwood, of gentle snoring from the corner where Daisy's bed lay empty. He found her there, still and peaceful as if she were merely sleeping. John cradled her small form against his chest, and for the first time since Helen's death, he wept, not just for Daisy, but for the life of peace that had been stolen from him, for the final gift Helen had given him, now taken away. In the basement of his home, behind a concrete floor that looked permanent and undisturbed, John kept the remnants of his former life sealed away. With methodical precision, he broke through the concrete, revealing a hidden chamber that contained the tools and memories of who he used to be. Here were weapons maintained in perfect condition, despite years of neglect. Here were gold coins bearing strange symbols, currency of a world most people never knew existed. Here were suits tailored for a different kind of work, clothes that had once been his uniform in a life of shadows and whispers. John cleaned each weapon with the care of a craftsman tending to his tools. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative. Each action brought back muscle memory that had never truly left him, skills that had been dormant but never dead. He dressed carefully, the suit fitting him like a second skin. In the mirror, the quiet suburban widower disappeared, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, but also strangely more alive than he had been in years. The Continental Hotel stood in the heart of the city like a beacon for those who lived in the spaces between legal and illegal, moral and necessary. Its elegant lobby concealed a world of rules and traditions older than any law, governed by codes of honor that meant life or death. Winston, the hotel's manager, greeted John with the weariness of an old friend who had hoped never to see him again. "John," he said simply, his British accent adding gravity to the single word. "I thought you were retired." "I was," John replied, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "But they killed my dog." In the world John had left behind, such a statement might have seemed trivial, even absurd, but Winston understood. He had known John long enough to know that the dog represented something far more precious. It represented the last piece of the peaceful life Helen had given him, the final thread connecting him to the man he had become through her love. "I see," Winston said quietly. "I'm sorry for your loss." What followed was not revenge in the simple sense of the word, but rather a reckoning. John moved through the criminal underworld like a force of nature, precise and unstoppable. Each encounter was both dance and duel, choreographed violence that spoke to years of training and natural ability. The nightclub where Iosif thought he was safe became a maze of shadows and sound, where John moved like a ghost among the pounding music and flashing lights. Bodies fell silently in the chaos, and by the time the music stopped, justice had been served with surgical precision. But John's actions had consequences that rippled through the criminal underworld like stones thrown into still water. Viggo Tarasov, Yusef's father, was a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. The death of his son could not go unanswered, not if he wanted to maintain his position of power. Viggo understood who John Wick was in ways his son never could. He knew the stories, the legends that other criminals whispered about in the dark. John Wick, he told his men, his voice heavy with the weight of inevitability, is a man of focus, commitment and sheer will. He once killed 3 men in a bar with a pencil. A pencil. The war that followed was swift and terrible. John's former colleagues, bound by contracts and codes of their shadowy profession, came for him one by one. Each battle was fought in the spaces ordinary people never see. Empty warehouses, abandoned buildings, the hidden corners of a city that never sleeps. Through it all, John moved with the efficiency of a machine and the grace of a dancer. He was hurt, bloodied, pushed to his limits, but never broken. Each fight brought him closer to his goal, each victory a step toward honoring the memory of the small dog who had loved him unconditionally. The final confrontation took place in the rain, as if the city itself were weeping for all the violence and loss. Viggo Tarasov, his empire crumbling around him, faced John with the resigned dignity of a man who knew his time had come. "It was just a dog," Viggo said, though his voice carried no conviction. "It wasn't just a dog," John replied, rain streaming down his face like tears. "It was the last gift from my wife. It was hope." In the end, justice was served not with satisfaction, but with the hollow emptiness that comes when vengeance cannot truly restore what was lost. Viggo fell, his organization scattered to the winds, but Daisy remained gone, and the house John returned to was still filled with silence. Yet something had changed. In fighting for Daisy's memory, John had honored Helen's final gift. He had protected the love they represented, even if he could not bring them back. The violence had served its purpose, but it could not heal the deeper wounds in his heart. Standing in the wreckage of his former peace, John made a choice. The weapons went back into their hiding place, the suits back into their dark corners, He would not return to his old life, but neither could he return to the innocent happiness he had known with Helen. Instead, he would find a middle path. At an animal shelter, among the cages of abandoned and unwanted creatures, John found a new companion, a pit bull with sad eyes and a gentle spirit, scheduled to be put down that very day. The dog looked at him with the same trusting gaze Daisy had given him, and John felt something shift in his chest. "What's his name?" John asked the shelter worker. "He doesn't have one," came the reply. "Would you like to give him one?" John looked into the dog's eyes and saw not a replacement for what he had lost, but a new beginning. "I think I'll just call him Dog," he said softly. Sometimes the simplest names carry the most meaning. As they walked home together, John and his new companion moved through the city like two souls who had found each other in their darkest hour. The dog stayed close to John's side, somehow understanding that this man had saved him from more than just death. He had saved him from being alone. Peace, John learned, was not a destination but a constant choice. His actions had created waves in the criminal underworld that continued to spread outward like ripples on a pond. Former colleagues emerged from the shadows, some seeking to test themselves against the legendary John Wick, others simply unable to let sleeping dogs lie. Santino D'Antonio arrived at John's door like a ghost from his past, carrying a marker, a blood oath, sealed in the ancient traditions of their world. Years ago, when John had needed help with what seemed an impossible task, Santino had provided it. Now the debt had come due. "I'm retired," John said, standing in his doorway with Dog at his side. "No one ever really retires from our world," Santino replied with a smile that held no warmth. "We just pretend to until the past comes calling." The task Santino demanded would force John back into the life he had tried to leave behind. But refusal would mean becoming hunted by every assassin in the world. Sometimes John realized the price of peace was accepting that it could never be permanent. What followed was a journey through the hidden world that existed parallel to ordinary life. In Rome, among ancient architecture and timeless beauty, John moved through museums and catacombs past tourists and lovers, carrying out a mission that would free him from one obligation while creating other. The sommelier who sold weapons instead of wine greeted John like an old friend returning from a long journey. "Mr. Wick," he said with genuine pleasure, "how good to see you again. Are you here for dinner or business?" "Dinner," John replied, and they both understood that this was a different kind of meal being prepared. The Continental Hotel, that neutral ground where business was never conducted and blood was never spilled, became both sanctuary and prison. When John's actions in Rome led to consequences he hadn't foreseen, he found himself declared excommunicado, cut off from all services, all protection, all aid. Winston looked at his old friend with genuine sadness. "I'm sorry, John," he said as he stamped the order that would make John a target for every assassin in the world. "You know I have to." "I know," John replied, understanding that some rules were bigger than friendship, some codes more binding than personal loyalty. What followed was a chase through the neon-lit streets of New York, where every face could hide an enemy, every shadow could conceal death. John moved through crowds of ordinary people, commuters heading home, couples on dates, children with their parents, all of them unaware that a war was being fought in the spaces between their normal lives. The Bowery King, who ruled the city's homeless population like an underground emperor, offered John shelter and wisdom. Sometimes, he said, feeding pigeons from his rooftop kingdom, a man has to make a choice between what's right and what's necessary. The trick is learning to live with whichever one you choose. In the Sahara Desert, where sand meets sky in endless stretches of gold and blue, John sought audience with the elder, the mysterious figure who sat above even the high table, the shadowy organization that governed their world of shadows and contracts. The journey nearly killed him, but John's determination was stronger than the desert's heat or his body's limitations. The elder was ancient in ways that had nothing to do with years, wise in the manner of someone who had seen empires rise and fall like waves on a beach. "You seek absolution," the elder said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "I seek to make things right," John replied, kneeling in the sand with the humility of a man who had learned that some forces were greater than individual will. "Then you must give up the one thing you value most," came the reply. "Your freedom to choose. Serve the high table without question, and you may find the peace you seek." John returned to New York with a new mission, a new purpose, but also a new burden. The price of peace, he was learning, was sometimes higher than the cost of war. The final battle took place where it had all begun, in the Continental Hotel, that sacred ground where violence was forbidden, but where all debts ultimately came due. Winston, forced to choose between his loyalty to John and his loyalty to the high table, made the hardest decision of his life. "Business or personal?" Winston asked, his hand steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. "Personal," John replied, understanding that sometimes friendship demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The shot echoed through the hotel's elegant lobby, and John fell from the rooftop into the alley below, his body broken but his spirit somehow intact. As he lay there, looking up at the sky through the narrow space between buildings, John saw not an ending but another beginning. Dog found him there, loyal and patient, waiting for his master to get up and continue their journey together. With effort that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical body, John struggled to his feet. He was hurt, possibly dying, but he was also free. Free from obligations, free from the past, free to choose his own path forward. In the world John inhabited, death was rarely permanent and peace was never guaranteed. His survival of the fall from the Continental was just another chapter in a story that seemed to have no ending, only pauses between conflicts. New enemies emerged from the shadows. The Marquis de Gramont, a high table member, who saw John's continued existence as a personal affront to the organization's authority. Old friends revealed themselves as enemies, and former enemies sometimes proved to be unexpected allies. Through it all, John moved with the weary grace of a man who had accepted that his life would never be simple, never be quiet, never be the peaceful existence he had shared with Helen. But he had also learned that peace was not always about the absence of conflict. Sometimes it was about finding purpose within the struggle. At Osaka's Continental, run by his old friend Koji, John found temporary sanctuary and the bitter reminder that his presence brought danger to everyone he cared about. "The old ways are dying," Koji told him as they shared tea in a traditional garden, cherry blossoms falling around them like snow. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," John replied, watching the petals drift on the evening breeze. Paris, the city of light, became the stage for what felt like a final performance. The Sacré-Cœur Basilica, standing proud and white against the morning sky, offered sanctuary not from violence, but from the endless cycle of vengeance that had defined John's return to his former life. The duel at sunrise was conducted with the formality of a different age, when honor meant something and death was accepted as the price of living fully. John faced his opponent not with hatred, but with the tired acceptance of a man who had fought too many battles and lost too many people he loved. As the sun rose over Paris, painting the city in shades of gold and rose, John thought not of the violence that had brought him to this moment, but of Helen's smile, of Daisy's playful bark, of Dog's loyal presence. He thought of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, of love found and lost and somehow found again in different forms. The shot rang out clear and sharp in the morning air, echoing off ancient stones and modern glass alike. And in that moment, whether it meant ending or beginning, John Wick found something he had been seeking all along. Not victory or defeat, but completion. In the end, John's story was not really about revenge or violence or the criminal underworld that had shaped so much of his life. It was about love. Love for Helen, who had shown him what peace looked like. Love for Daisy, who had represented hope in its purest form. Love for Dog, who had taught him that loyalty could exist without conditions. It was about the quiet moments between the chaos, the simple pleasures that make life worth living. The understanding that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is choose to love again after losing everything. As night falls and this tale comes to its close, let your mind drift like cherry blossoms on a gentle breeze. Let the weight of the day dissolve like sugar in warm tea. John Wick's journey reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when all seems lost, there is always the possibility of finding peace. If not in the world around us, then in the choices we make and the love we choose to carry forward. In the quiet corners of New York City, where shadows dance softly between streetlights and the world moves at a gentler pace, there lived a man named John Wick. Once upon a time, John had been someone else entirely, a figure who moved through darkness with purpose and precision. But that was before Helen. Helen was like morning sunlight breaking through heavy curtains, warm and golden and transformative. She had found John when he was lost in a world of cold steel and colder hearts. With patience and love, she had shown him that there was more to existence than the life he had known. Slowly, like a flower blooming in spring, John discovered what it meant to be truly alive. Their love story unfolded like pages in a favorite book, each day bringing new chapters of quiet joy. They would walk through Central Park on Sunday mornings, Helen's hand tucked safely in John's, talking about everything and nothing. She would laugh at his awkward attempts at domestic life, the way he burned toast or forgot to water the plants. But her laughter was never cruel, only filled with the kind of affection that makes a house feel like home. John had left his old life behind completely, hanging up his past like a coat he no longer needed. He found work that brought him satisfaction without danger, and for the first time in years he slept peacefully through the night. Helen would curl up beside him, her breathing soft and steady, and John would marvel at how something so simple could feel so profound. They talked about the future often, making plans with the casual confidence of people who believed they had all the time in the world. A small house upstate perhaps, with a garden where Helen could grow her beloved roses. Maybe a dog to keep them company. Children, someday, when they were ready. John would listen to these dreams and feel his heart expand with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. But life, as it sometimes does, had different plans waiting in the wings. The first sign was subtle. A tiredness that didn't lift with rest. A pallor that worried John even as Helen dismissed it with her characteristic optimism. She would wave away his concerns with a gentle laugh, insisting she was fine, that everyone gets tired sometimes. But John knew better. He had learned to read the subtle signs of danger. And though this was a different kind of threat, his instincts whispered warnings he desperately wanted to ignore. The doctor's office was sterile and cold, filled with the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everything look harsh and unforgiving. John sat beside Helen, holding her hand as they waited for results that would change everything. When the doctor finally spoke, his words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond that small room. Cancer, the word hung in the air between them, heavy and immutable. Helen squeezed John's hand, and he felt her trembling despite her brave smile. They would fight it, of course. They would do everything possible, try every treatment, hold on to hope with both hands. But there was something in the doctor's eyes, a gentleness that spoke of battles often lost, that made John's heart sink like a stone. The months that followed were a blur of hospitals and treatments, of small victories and crushing setbacks. John became Helen's shadow, never leaving her side except when absolutely necessary. He learned the rhythms of illness, the good days when she could sit in the garden and watch the roses bloom, and the difficult days when she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Through it all, Helen maintained her grace, her ability to find light in the darkest moment. She would joke with the nurses, comfort other patients, and somehow manage to take care of John even as her own strength faded. On the nights when the pain was too much for sleep, she would tell him stories of their imagined future, painting pictures of the life they would have when this was all over. But John could see the truth in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. A mixture of love and sorrow that broke his heart into smaller pieces each day. She was saying goodbye, he realized, even as she fought to stay. She was preparing him for a world without her, even though the very thought made him feel as though he were drowning. As autumn painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, Helen's condition worsened. The treatments that had once offered hope now seemed to cause more harm than healing. In quiet moments, when the hospital room was filled with the soft beeping of machines and the distant sounds of life continuing beyond their small bubble of grief, Helen and John made the decision to come home. Their house felt different now, charged with the weight of impending loss. John had transformed their bedroom into a sanctuary, filled with soft pillows and the scent of Helen's favorite flowers. He learned to be a caregiver, mastering the art of small comforts, the perfect cup of tea, the gentle touch that eased pain, the stories that distracted from difficult moments. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as Helen lay propped up against pillows watching the sunset paint their bedroom walls in shades of pink and gold, that she told him about the surprise she had arranged. Her voice was weak but filled with the kind of mischief that had first captured his heart. "There's something coming," she whispered, her eyes bright with secret knowledge. "Something to help you when I'm gone." John wanted to protest, to insist that she wasn't going anywhere, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he simply held her hand and waited for her to continue. "I know you think you'll be alone," she said, her fingers tracing patterns on his palm. "But you won't be. Love doesn't end just because someone goes away. It transforms, but it doesn't disappear." The next morning, Helen slipped away as quietly as she had lived, her final breath a gentle sigh that seemed to carry all the love she couldn't take with her. John sat beside her in the golden light of dawn, holding her hand as it grew cold, feeling as though a part of his soul had been torn away. The funeral was a blur of faces and condolences, of flowers and kind words that felt hollow in the face of such profound loss. John moved through it all like a ghost, present but not really there, his heart too broken to fully comprehend the reality of a world without Helen. It was after the service, after the last mourner had left and John sat alone in their empty house, that the doorbell rang. He almost didn't answer it, but something, perhaps the memory of Helen's mysterious smile, made him open the door. A delivery man stood there with a small carrier, and inside was the most beautiful beagle puppy John had ever seen. The accompanying note was in Helen's handwriting. "So you always have a friend. Her name is Daisy. Love her like you loved me." Daisy was sunshine captured in canine form, all golden fur and boundless energy, and unconditional love. She seemed to understand with the intuitive wisdom that animals possess, that John was broken and in need of healing. She would curl up beside him on the couch, her warm weight a comfort against his chest, and somehow make the silence of the house feel less oppressive. In the weeks that followed Helen's death, Daisy became John's anchor to the world of the living. She demanded walks, which forced him to leave the house and breathe fresh air. She needed food and attention, which gave structure to his day. Most importantly, she offered the kind of uncomplicated love that asks for nothing in return except presence. John found himself talking to Daisy as they walked through the neighborhood, sharing memories of Helen and thoughts about the future that felt impossible to navigate alone. The little dog would listen with the serious attention of a therapist, her head tilted and her eyes focused on his face as though she understood every word. Slowly, very slowly, John began to heal. Not completely. He suspected that would take far longer than he had imagined, but enough to function, enough to find small moments of peace in Daisy's companionship. He began to sleep through the night again, comforted by the sound of her gentle breathing from her bed beside his own. He started eating regular meals, motivated by the need to take care of this small creature who depended on him. It was during one of their evening walks, as autumn gave way to winter and the air grew crisp with the promise of snow, that John realized something profound. Helen had been right. Love didn't disappear when someone died. It transformed. The love he had felt for his wife now flowed toward this small dog who had become his lifeline, his connection to hope and healing. Daisy had given him a reason to continue living, a purpose beyond grief. She had shown him that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. For the first time since Helen's death, John felt something approaching gratitude. Not for the loss, that would always be a wound that ached, but for the gift of Daisy's presence, for the reminder that love could take many forms. It was a Tuesday when everything changed again. One of those ordinary days that feel unremarkable until they become the hinge upon which your entire life turns. John had been at the gas station, filling up his vintage Mustang, a car that Helen had loved for its classic lines and the way it made her feel like they were in an old movie. Daisy was with him, as she always was, her head hanging out the window and her tail wagging at the simple joy of being alive. The young men who approached seemed harmless at first. Just kids, really. Probably not much older than 20. They admired the car with the kind of enthusiasm that John might have found endearing under different circumstances. But there was something in their eyes, a hardness that spoke of lives lived without consequence, that made John's old instincts stir uneasily. "Nice car," one of them said, running his hand along the hood with a familiarity that made John's jaw tighten. "How much you want for it?" "It's not for sale." John replied simply, his voice calm but firm. He had learned long ago that the best way to diffuse tension was to remain steady, to not give aggression any fuel to feed on. But these young men weren't interested in de-escalation. They were looking for something, excitement perhaps, or the thrill of taking what they want. When John politely declined their increasingly insistent offers, their demeanor shifted. What had started as casual interest became something darker, more predatory. "Listen, old man," the leader said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Maybe you didn't hear me. I said I want your car." John looked at him, really looked, and saw the kind of casual cruelty that he had hoped never to encounter again. These weren't desperate men driven to crime by necessity. They were bullies, taking what they wanted because they believed they could, because they had never been made to face the consequences of their actions. "Walk away," John said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to Daisy's leash. "Just walk away." But they didn't walk away. Instead, they escalated, their voices rising, their postures becoming more aggressive. Other customers at the gas station began to notice, some moving away, others pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a confrontation. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. The young men, frustrated by John's refusal to be intimidated, decided to take what they wanted by force. They attacked him with the kind of reckless violence that speaks of lives lived without boundaries or consequence. John fought back, of course. Even after years of peaceful retirement, his body remembered the lessons of his former life. But he was outnumbered, and more importantly, he was trying to protect Daisy, who had become frightened by the shouting and violence. In the end, that protection cost him consciousness, and cost him everything that mattered. John woke up in the hospital with a head that felt like it had been split open and a heart that somehow knew, even before his mind could process the information, that something fundamental had been taken from him. The police officer who sat beside his bed was kind but matter-of-fact, delivering news that hit John like physical blows. The car was gone, of course, that was expected, and in the grand scheme of things, replaceable. But Daisy, sweet, innocent Daisy, who had never hurt anyone, who had been John's connection to joy and hope, Daisy was gone too. "Not stolen," the officer explained with the kind of clinical language that people use to discuss unspeakable things. "Killed, murdered, destroyed for no reason other than the casual cruelty of young men who saw violence as entertainment." John said nothing during the officer's report. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but feel the world collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. The officer gave him a card, told him to call if he remembered anything else, and left John alone with his grief. Alone, the word echoed in his mind like a bell tolling. He was alone now in a way that he had never been before. Helen was gone, taken by illness despite all their fighting and hoping. And now Daisy, Helen's final gift, his bridge back to the world of the living, was gone too, taken by the kind of senseless violence that John had spent years trying to forget. The house felt like a tomb when he finally returned from the hospital. Every corner held memories of Daisy, her favorite sleeping spot by the window, the toys scattered across the living room floor, the water bowl that would never be used again. John found himself listening for the sound of her paws on the hardwood floors, waiting for her to come running to greet him as she always had. But there was only silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you understand what people mean when they talk about deafening quiet. John sat in his chair, the same chair where he had held Helen during her final weeks, where Daisy had curled up beside him on countless evenings, and felt something dark and familiar stirring in his chest. For days he didn't move. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't answer the phone when it rang. He simply sat in that chair and felt the weight of loss settling over him like a shroud. Neighbors knocked on the door, left casseroles on the porch, called to check on him. But John couldn't bring himself to care about their kindness. He couldn't bring himself to care about anything. It was Marcus who finally broke through the walls John had built around his grief. Marcus, who had been John's friend and colleague in the old days, who understood the language of loss and the weight of regret. He didn't knock on the door or call out cheerful greetings. He simply used the key that John had given him years ago, during happier times, and walked into the house like he belonged there. "You look like hell," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from John with the easy familiarity of old friendship. "When's the last time you ate?" John didn't answer. He couldn't remember eating, couldn't remember the last time he had been aware of hunger or thirst, or any of the basic needs that keep a body functioning. He felt like he was disappearing, piece by piece, until soon there would be nothing left but the chair and the silence. "I heard about the dog," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, I know what she meant to you." Still John said nothing, but something in his chest tightened, a knot of pain and rage that had been growing larger with each passing hour. Marcus seemed to sense it, leaning forward with the kind of attention that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "I also heard about who did it," he said. "Iosif Tarasov, Vigo's boy. Little punk with more money than sense and a father who's always cleaned up his mess." At the mention of those names, John felt something shift inside him. Not quite awakening, not yet, but a stirring, like an animal opening one eye to assess a potential threat. Vigo Tarasov. He knew that name, knew the weight it carried in certain circles, knew the kind of man who would raise a son capable of such casual cruelty. "He doesn't know who you are," Marcus continued, "doesn't know what he's done, but his father will, once he finds out. And when he does," Marcus trailed off, but John didn't need him to finish the thought. He knew how this story would unfold, knew the rules of the world he had left behind. There would be consequences, certainly, but they would be the kind of consequences that men like Vigo Tarasov understood. Business consequences, financial consequences, not the kind that would bring back a small dog whose only crime had been loving the wrong person. After Marcus left, John sat in the growing darkness of his empty house and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The slow, cold burn of purpose. Not the gentle purpose that Helen had given him, or the healing purpose that Daisy had represented. This was something darker, more familiar. It was the purpose that had once made him feared in circles, where fear was a currency more valuable than gold. The storage unit sat in a forgotten corner of the city, one of those places where people keep the pieces of their lives they can't bear to throw away but can't stand to see every day. John hadn't been there since his wedding day, when he had locked away the tools of his former trade with the solemnity of a man burying the dead. The concrete floor was cold beneath his feet as he approached the small, unremarkable locker that contained his past. His hands shook slightly as he entered the combination, not from fear but from the weight of what he was about to unleash. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the empty building like a gunshot. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved with the care of a curator tending to priceless artifacts, were the instruments of his former life. Guns, knives, tools whose names most people wouldn't recognize, but whose purposes were unmistakable to anyone who had walked in John's world. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in a cloth that Helen had sewn for him during their early days together, were the gold coins that served as currency in the underworld's economy. John lifted each item with the reverence of a priest handling sacred objects, feeling the familiar weight of steel and purpose. His hands remembered the grip of each weapon, the balance and feel that had once been as natural to him as breathing. As he loaded the guns and checked their mechanisms, he felt something inside him clicking into place, like tumblers in a lock finally aligning. The man who had grieved in silence for days was gone, replaced by someone harder, more focused. Someone who understood that some wrongs could only be answered with violence, that some debts could only be paid in blood. John Wick, the real John Wick, the one who had earned his reputation through years of precise, methodical work, was returning to the world. But this wasn't the same man who had once killed for money or power, or the simple satisfaction of a job well done. This was someone driven by love and loss, by the need to balance scales that had been tipped too far toward injustice. He wasn't coming back because he enjoyed the work, or because he missed the adrenaline. He was coming back because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to make the living pay. The house felt different when he returned, no longer a tomb but a staging ground. John moved through it with purpose now, gathering supplies and making preparations with the methodical efficiency that had once made him legendary. He cleaned his weapons, planned his approach, and tried not to think about what Helen would say if she could see him now. But even as he prepared for war, he knew she would understand. Helen had seen the darkness in him, had known what he was capable of, and had loved him anyway. She had never asked him to be someone else, had never demanded that he pretend his past didn't exist. She had simply shown him a different way to live, a better way to be. Now that way was closed to him, and he was returning to the only path he knew. As he loaded the magazines and checked the sights on his weapons, John whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, not for forgiveness, but for the strength to do what needed to be done. For Daisy, for Helen, for the part of himself that had died with them both. The war was coming, and John Wick was ready to fight it. And so our story comes full circle, like all the best bedtime tales do. John Wick, the man who had found peace in love and lost it to violence, was returning to the world that had made him, not because he wanted to, but because sometimes the only way to honor what we've lost is to ensure that those who took it understand the weight of their actions. In the quiet hours of the night, as the city sleeps and dreams of simpler things, John Wick prepares for battle. He moves through the shadows with the grace of a ghost, carrying the memory of a woman who taught him to love and a dog who taught him to hope. Their spirits guide him now, not toward revenge but toward a kind of justice that the world might not understand but that his heart knows is necessary. The young men who destroyed his peace sleep soundly in their beds, unaware that their actions have awakened something that was meant to stay buried. They took a car and killed a dog and thought nothing of it, the way children might break a toy and move on to the next game. But they don't understand that some toys, once broken, release monsters that cannot be easily contained. Tomorrow will bring consequences that they cannot imagine, justice that they cannot escape. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness before the storm, let us remember what this story is really about. It's not about violence or revenge or the settling of score. It's about love, the love that transforms us, the love that sustains us, and the love that sometimes demands we do terrible things in its name. John Wick sleeps now, his weapons clean and his purpose clear, dreaming perhaps of Helen's smile and Daisy's warm wame against his chest. And in the morning he will wake to do what must be done, carrying their love with him into whatever darkness lies ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the city as John Wick emerged from his house, transformed. Gone was the broken man who had sat in silence for days, replaced by something harder, more focused. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and measured. The suit he wore was perfectly tailored, dark as midnight, and beneath it lay the tools of his former trade. His first destination was a place that existed between worlds, neither fully legitimate nor entirely criminal. The red circle, a club that pulsed with bass-heavy music and served as a gathering place for those who lived in the shadows. It was here that Iosif Tarasov, the young man who had shattered John's peace, would be celebrating his latest acquisition, a vintage Mustang that had once belonged to a grieving widower. John parked across the street and watched the club's entrance with the patience of a hunter. He had learned long ago that the key to success in his line of work was not speed or aggression, but careful observation and perfect timing. The night was young, and the club was just beginning to fill with the kind of people who emerged after dark: dealers and users, soldiers and lieutenants in the city's criminal hierarchy. As he waited, John's mind drifted to the intelligence he had gathered. Iosif Tarasov was the son of Vigo Tarasov, a Russian crime boss who had built his empire on violence and intimidation. The boy had grown up insulated from the consequences of his actions, protected by his father's power and wealth. He had taken what he wanted without thought or remorse, never imagining that his victims might have the means to strike back. But this victim was different. This victim was John Wick. The club's interior was a maze of strobing lights and writhing bodies, the kind of environment that would disorient most people but felt familiar to John. He had operated in similar spaces before, using chaos and confusion as cover for his work. Tonight, however, he wasn't interested in subtlety. Tonight was about sending a message that would echo through the underworld's corridors. John moved through the crowd like a ghost, his trained eyes scanning faces and noting exits, cataloging threats and opportunity. He found Iosif at the bar, surrounded by friends and admirers, drunk on vodka and his own perceived invincibility. The young man was laughing at something one of his companions had said, his face flushed with alcohol and arrogance. For a moment, John simply watched him. This was the person who had destroyed his last connection to Helen, who had murdered an innocent animal for sport. There was nothing special about him, no particular intelligence or skill, just the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequence. In another life, John might have felt pity for such a person. Tonight he felt only cold purpose. What followed was less a fight than a symphony of violence, each movement precise and purposeful. John had not forgotten the lessons of his former life: how to move through a crowd undetected, how to neutralize threats before they could react, how to turn the environment itself into a weapon. The club's patrons, initially unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst, gradually began to realize that something was terribly wrong. John's approach was methodical, working his way through Iosif's security detail with the efficiency of a master craftsman. Each encounter was brief and decisive, his movements flowing like water around obstacles. He had learned long ago that the key to surviving in overwhelming odds was to never allow your enemies to coordinate their attacks, to keep them off balance and react. The music continued to pulse through the club's speakers, providing an incongruous soundtrack to the violence. Strobing lights created a surreal atmosphere, turning the confrontation into a series of freeze-frame images. John's silhouette against the bar, a security guard falling backward into the crowd, the flash of steel in the kaleidoscope lighting. Iosif, initially protected by his father's reputation and his own bodyguards, gradually found himself isolated as John systematically eliminated his protection. The young man's arrogance slowly transformed into confusion, then fear, as he began to understand that he was not dealing with an ordinary victim. This was someone who moved through violence with the grace of a dancer, who turned the club's chaos into his own personal advantage. When John finally reached him, Iosif was backing away from the bar, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from suddenly understanding that you are prey rather than predator. His friends had scattered, his bodyguards were down, and he stood alone in a crowd of strangers who wanted nothing to do with his problems. "You killed my dog," John said, his voice barely audible above the music, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You destroyed my car. You took away the last thing I had left of my wife." Iosif opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to offer money, perhaps to beg for mercy. But John was not interested in words. He had come here not for conversation but for justice. And justice, he had learned, was not something that could be negotiated or bargained away. The confrontation ended as it had begun, with John's methodical precision. Iosef Tarasov, the young man who had thought himself untouchable, discovered that there were some lines that should never be crossed, some people who should never be wronged. His death was swift and final, a punctuation mark at the end of a very short, very violent sentence. News of Iosef's death reached Viggo Tarasov within hours, carried by the surviving witnesses and the city's criminal grapevine. The Russian crime boss received the information in his office, a opulent space that served as the command center for his empire. Maps covered the walls marking territories and operations, while expensive art and furniture proclaimed his wealth and status. Viggo was a man who had built his power through careful calculation and ruthless efficiency. He had survived decades in a business where most men died young by understanding when to fight and when to negotiate, when to show strength and when to show mercy. But the death of his son had stripped away his careful composure, leaving behind something raw and dangerous. "Find out who did this," he commanded his lieutenants, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that had made him feared throughout the city. "I want to know everything. Who he is, where he lives, what he loves, and then I want him brought to me alive." But even as he spoke, Viggo felt a chill of recognition. The description of the killer, a man who moved like a professional, who had carved through trained security with surgical precision, triggered memories that he had hoped never to revisit. There was only one person he knew who could have done what the witnesses described. Only one man who possessed the skills and the reputation to single-handedly destroy a room full of armed guards. The phone call came an hour later, confirming his worst fears. John Wick had returned. Viggo stared at the phone for a long moment after hanging up, his mind racing through the implications. John Wick, the Baba Yaga, the boogeyman. The one you sent to kill the boogeyman. The man who had retired from the life years ago, who had hung up his guns and walked away from the world of violence and retribution. The man who had killed Iosef. The irony was not lost on him. His son, in his arrogance and stupidity, had awakened something that was meant to stay sleeping, had picked a fight with the one person in the world who could destroy everything Viggo had built. The boy had killed John Wick's dog, a gift from his dead wife, he had learned, and in doing so had signed not just his own death warrant, but potentially the death warrant of every man in Viggo's organization. Viggo had known John in the old days, had worked with him on occasion when their interests aligned. He had seen what the man could do when properly motivated, had witnessed firsthand the methodical destruction he could unleash. But that John Wick had been a professional, a man who killed for money and reputation. This John Wick was something else entirely. A man driven by grief and loss, motivated not by profit, but by the need to balance cosmic scale. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation and positioning. Viggo mobilized his entire organization, calling in favors and deploying resources with the efficiency of a general preparing for war. Safe houses were established, escape routes planned, and every available gun was put on the street. The Russian crime boss understood that he was facing an existential threat, and he responded with the kind of overwhelming force that had made him powerful. But John Wick was not an ordinary enemy. He was a ghost who moved through the city's underworld like a force of nature, striking without warning and disappearing before retaliation could be organized. He had spent years learning the rhythms of criminal organizations, understanding their hierarchies and vulnerability. Now he used that knowledge like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away Viggo's power structure piece by piece. The first to fall were the moneymen, the accountants and bookkeepers who kept track of the organization's finance. John found them in their offices and safe houses, protected by layers of security that proved as effective as tissue paper against his skills. He eliminated them with the same methodical precision he had shown at the club, taking not just their lives but their records, their codes, their access to the vast network of accounts that funded Viggo's empire. Next came the lieutenants, the men who translated Viggo's orders into action on the street. John hunted them with the patience of a predator, learning their routines and habits, striking when they were most vulnerable. He turned their own paranoia against them, using their fear to drive them into making mistakes that he could exploit. The city's underworld began to buzz with rumors and whispers. The Baba Yaga had returned, they said, and he was hunting Russian. Bodies were piling up, and not just any bodies. These were made men, protected figures who should have been untouchable. The fact that they were dying with such regularity suggested that the natural order of things had been fundamentally disrupted. Viggo felt his empire crumbling around him, each death report another nail in the coffin of his power. His remaining men were scared, jumping at shadows and seeing threats in every corner. Some were deserting, disappearing into the night rather than face the legendary assassin. Others were becoming increasingly paranoid, turning on each other in their fear and desperation. But the Russian crime boss was not without resources. He had connections throughout the city's criminal hierarchy, debts that could be called in and favors that could be demanded. If John Wick wanted a war, Viggo would give him one. He would mobilize every gun, every blade, every killer in the city if necessary. He would turn the entire underworld against the man who had dared to kill his son. In the heart of the city stood a building that existed outside the normal rules of criminal warfare. The Continental Hotel was neutral ground, a place where even the most bitter enemies could meet without fear of violence. Its elegance and old-world charm masked a darker purpose. It was the headquarters of a shadow economy that operated parallel to the legitimate world, governed by its own rules and traditions. John Wick entered the Continental like a man returning home after a long journey. The lobby was filled with the kind of people who looked perfectly respectable on the surface, but carried themselves with the subtle confidence of those who lived by violence. Businessmen who were actually arms dealers, socialites who were money launderers, tourists who were assassins. The Continental attracted them all with its promise of safety and discretion. Winston, the hotel's manager, greeted John with the warmth of an old friend. The older man had known John for years, had watched him rise through the ranks of the criminal hierarchy, and had been present at his retirement. He understood better than most what it meant for John Wick to be back in the world, and he recognized the signs of a man who had been pushed beyond his breaking point. "John," Winston said, settling into a chair across from his old friend, "I heard about Helen and about the dog. I'm sorry." John nodded, accepting the condolence with the grace of a man who had heard many such expressions in recent days. But Winston's sympathy felt different. It came from someone who understood the weight of loss, who had seen enough death to know that some wounds never truly heal. "I need information," John said simply. "Viggo's operations, his safe houses, his escape routes, everything." Winston studied him for a moment, his experienced eyes taking in the subtle changes in his old friend. This was not the John Wick who had retired years ago, content to live in domestic bliss. This was something harder, more dangerous. The man who had once killed for money and reputation had been transformed into something that killed for love and justice. "He's mobilizing everything," Winston warned. "Every gun, every blade, every killer in the city. He's put a bounty on your head that would make lesser men rich beyond their dreams. You're walking into a war zone." John's response was a smile that held no warmth, only cold promise. "I'm counting on it." The information came in the form of files and photographs, addresses and schedules, the kind of intelligence that could only be gathered by an organization with resources and connections throughout the city's underworld. Winston provided it all without hesitation, understanding that some debts transcended the normal rules of business. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse that played out across the city's sprawling landscape. Viggo's men hunted John with the desperation of soldiers fighting for their lives, while John hunted them with the methodical precision of a professional killer. The streets became a battleground where shadows held death and every corner could conceal an ambush. John moved through the city like a ghost, using his knowledge of its rhythms and patterns to stay ahead of his pursuers. He had learned long ago that the key to survival in hostile territory was not to fight every battle, but to choose when and where to engage. He struck at Viggo's operations with surgical precision, crippling the organization's ability to function while avoiding the kind of direct confrontations that would expose him to unnecessary risk. The Russian crime boss responded with increasing desperation, throwing more and more resources into the hunt. He hired mercenaries and freelancers, called in favors from other organizations, and put every available gun on the street. The city's underworld became a powder keg, with ordinary criminals caught in the crossfire between John's methodical campaign and Viggo's increasingly frantic response. But John Wick was not just any target. He was a legend made flesh, a man whose reputation had been built on years of successful operations and narrow escapes. He moved through the maze of threats and traps with the confidence of someone who had faced death so many times that it had become an old friend. His enemies found themselves fighting not just a man but a myth, the boogeyman who had haunted their nightmares for years. The turning point came when Viggo made a crucial mistake. Desperate to end the conflict, he reached out to other organizations, calling in favors and making promises that compromised his own position. The Italian crime families, the Chinese triads, the various gangs and cartels that shared the city's criminal landscape, all were approached with offers of alliance and mutual benefit. But John Wick had allies of his own, connections built over years of professional relationships and mutual respect. The underworld's code of honor, while twisted and complex, still held certain truths sacred. John had never broken his word, never betrayed a trust, never failed to honor a contract. That reputation now served him well, as doors opened and information flowed from sources that Viggo had never suspected. The end came, as it always does in such stories, with a confrontation between the two men whose conflict had set the city ablaze. Viggo, his empire crumbling around him and his resources exhausted, found himself trapped in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. His remaining men, those few who had not deserted or been killed, formed a final defensive perimeter around their boss. John Wick arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed appropriate for the final act of this bloody drama. He moved through the warehouse with the confidence of a man who had already won, his weapons ready but his demeanor calm. The scattered bodies of Viggo's guards marked his path like breadcrumbs, each one a testament to the futility of standing against the Baba Yaga. Viggo waited in his office, a glass of vodka in his hand and a gun on his desk. He was a man who had lived by violence for decades, who had built his power on the foundation of fear and intimidation. But now, facing the inevitable end of his reign, he felt something he had not experienced in years: genuine fear. "You could have just walked away," he said as John entered the room. "I would have paid you compensation, made amends. Your dog, your car, they could have been replaced." John's response was measured, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "They weren't just a dog and a car, they were my connection to her, my link to the life we built together. You can't replace something like that with money." The conversation that followed was brief and to the point. Viggo, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, found himself facing a man who operated on a different level entirely. This was not a negotiation or a business transaction. This was justice, pure and simple, delivered by someone who had nothing left to lose. When it was over, when Viggo Tarasov lay dead among the ruins of his empire, John Wick stood alone in the warehouse and felt something shift inside him. The rage that had driven him, the burning need for vengeance that had consumed his days and nights, began to fade, not disappear. He suspected it would always be there, a scar on his soul, but transform into something else. He had done what he set out to do. The men who had destroyed his peace were dead, their organizations scattered to the wind. Justice had been served, in the only way that men like them could understand. But the victory felt hollow, incomplete. Daisy was still gone, Helen was still dead, and John was still alone in a world that seemed determined to take away everything he loved. The aftermath of John's war against the Tarasov organization rippled through the city's underworld, like stones thrown into still water. The Russian crime family, once a major power in the criminal hierarchy, had been effectively destroyed. Their territories were absorbed by rival organizations, their operations taken over by opportunistic competitors. The balance of power in the city had shifted, creating new alliances and new conflict. John Wick had returned to his house as the sun rose on a new day, his mission complete, but his heart still heavy with loss. The weapons that had served him so well during his campaign were cleaned and stored away, but not retired. He had learned in the space of a few violent days that retirement was not something that could be chosen. It was something that had to be earned, and he had not yet earned it. The house felt different now, charged with the weight of what he had done. The silence was no longer oppressive, but expectant, as though the very walls were waiting to see what would come next. John moved through the rooms where he had once been happy, where he had once believed that love could conquer all, and felt the full weight of his transformation. He was no longer the man who had grieved silently for his wife and dog. He was no longer the retired assassin who had thought he could leave his past behind. He was something new, something shaped by loss and hardened by violence. He was the Baba Yaga, the boogeyman, the man who had reminded the underworld why legends are born. But legends, John understood, came with a price. He had achieved his vengeance, had balanced the scales of justice in the only way available to him. But in doing so, he had announced his return to a world that had thought him gone forever. The underworld now knew that John Wick was back, and that knowledge would bring new challenges, new enemies, new opportunities for those who thought they could succeed where Vigo had failed. The phone calls had already begun. Offers of work, requests for meetings, invitations to return to the life he had tried to leave behind. The criminal hierarchy was already adjusting to the reality of his return, recalculating risks and opportunities in light of his demonstrated capability. He had reminded them all of what he was capable of, and now they wanted to use that capability for their own purposes. As night fell over the city, John Wick sat in his chair and contemplated the path that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a man seeking simple vengeance, driven by grief and loss to strike back at those who had wronged him. But somewhere in the course of his campaign, he had become something more, a symbol of consequence in a world where actions too often went unpunished. The young men who had killed his dog and stolen his car had thought themselves above retribution, protected by their connections and their perceived invincibility. They had learned too late that there are some people who cannot be intimidated, some losses that cannot be ignored. Their deaths had sent a message that would echo through the underworld for years to come. That every action has consequences, that every crime has a price. But John's transformation was not yet complete. The man who had once sought only to retire and live in peace had been reborn as something harder, more dangerous. He had tasted vengeance and found it both satisfying and hollow, had reminded himself of the power he possessed and the cost of using it. The quiet life he had built with Helen seemed like a dream now, a brief interlude in a story that was far from over. Outside his window, the city pulsed with its usual rhythms, the flow of traffic, the distant sound of sirens, the everyday chaos of millions of people going about their lives. Most of them would never know that a war had been fought in their midst, that a legend had been reborn in their streets. They would continue their ordinary lives, blissfully unaware of the shadows that moved among them. But in the underworld, the name John Wick would be whispered with new respect and fear. The Baba Yaga had returned, and with him came the promise that the natural order would be maintained. Those who chose to live by violence would face the consequences of that choice, delivered by a man who had mastered the art of death and justice in equal measure. John closed his eyes and listened to the silence of his empty house, feeling the weight of his legend settling around him like a familiar coat. He had sought vengeance and found it, had pursued justice and delivered it. But in doing so, he had also found himself, had remembered who he was beneath the layers of grief and domesticity. He was John Wick, the boogeyman, the man who had reminded the world that some people should never be crossed. And though the price of that identity was higher than he had ever imagined, he wore it now with the pride of a man who had honored his promises and kept his word, even when the cost was everything he held dear.
In the heart of every great city, there exists a shadow world that mirrors our own. A place where different rules apply, and ancient codes govern the actions of those who dwell within its boundaries. To most people, the Continental Hotel appears to be nothing more than an elegant establishment catering to discerning travelers and business people. But beneath its polished marble floors and behind its ornate facades lies something far more extraordinary.
the beating heart of a secret society that has existed for centuries. The Continental is not merely a hotel, it is a sanctuary, a neutral ground where the most dangerous people in the world can find respite from their deadly profession. Here, in rooms furnished with antique elegance and modern comfort, assassins from every corner of the globe come to rest between contracts, to seek counsel from their peers, and to conduct the business of death with the same professionalism that others might bring to banking or law. The building itself seems to breathe with history, its walls holding secrets that span generations. Each room has been carefully designed to provide not just comfort, but security, with reinforced doors and soundproofed walls that ensure privacy for conversations that could topple governments or end lives. The corridors are patrolled by staff who move with the quiet efficiency of those who understand that discretion is not just preferred but essential to survival. Winston, the Continental's manager, presides over this hidden kingdom with the authority of a monarch and the wisdom of a sage. He has held his position for decades, watching assassins rise and fall, witnessing the evolution of the criminal underworld, while maintaining the delicate balance that keeps the Continental functioning as neutral ground. His office, located on the hotel's top floor, serves as both throne room and confessional, where the most powerful figures in the shadow world come to pay their respects and seek his counsel. The hotel's staff are not ordinary employees but carefully selected individuals who understand the unique nature of their workplace. The concierge knows how to procure weapons with the same efficiency that others might arrange dinner reservations. The housekeeping staff are trained to clean rooms where violence may have been discussed in detail, and they do so with the same thoroughness that they bring to removing ordinary stains. Each member of the Continental's team has been chosen not just for their professional skills, but for their ability to keep secrets and maintain the facade of normalcy that protects the hotel's true purpose. Guests arrive at all hours, traveling under assumed names and carrying passports from countries that may not exist on any official map. They speak in codes and euphemisms, conducting business that would horrify ordinary citizens while maintaining the polite civility of old-world aristocrats. The Continental's lobby often resembles a United Nations of death, with representatives from every major criminal organization mingling in an atmosphere of enforced peace. The Continental operates under a set of rules that are as ancient as they are absolute. These laws, passed down through generations of managers and enforced with deadly precision, form the foundation of the shadow world's civilization. They are not written in any book or carved in stone, but they live in the hearts and minds of every person who enters this sacred space, understood intuitively by those who have chosen to live by violence. The first and most sacred rule is simple in its statement, but profound in its implications. No business may be conducted on Continental grounds. This means that within the hotel's walls, even the most bitter enemies must maintain civility. Assassins who have spent years hunting each other can share a drink at the bar, knowing that their personal vendettas must be set aside until they leave the premises. The rule extends beyond mere violence to encompass all forms of professional conflict. Contracts cannot be negotiated, targets cannot be discussed, and payments cannot be exchanged while under the Continental's protection. This enforced neutrality creates an atmosphere that is both civilized and surreal. In the hotel's elegant dining room, one might observe a notorious arms dealer sharing a table with the very spy who has been trying to capture him for months. At the bar, assassins who have killed each other's partners raise toasts to fallen comrades while planning their next encounters. The Continental becomes a stage where the world's most dangerous people perform an elaborate dance of courtesy and restraint. The second rule governs the nature of sanctuary itself. Once a person has been granted safe passage to the Continental, they cannot be harmed while traveling to or from the hotel. This protection extends to a carefully defined radius around the building, creating a bubble of safety in an otherwise dangerous world. The rule has saved countless lives over the years, allowing wounded assassins to seek medical attention and providing refuge for those who need time to plan their next moves. Breaking these rules carries consequences that are both swift and final. The Continental's justice is administered not by courts or judges, but by a network of enforcers who understand that maintaining the hotel's neutrality is essential to the survival of their entire civilization. Those who violate the sacred laws find themselves marked for death, hunted not by individuals, but by the entire community of professionals who depend on the Continental's continued existence. The enforcement of these rules creates a paradox that defines the Shadow World's character. Here are gathered the most violent people on Earth, yet they maintain an atmosphere of almost Victorian propriety. The threat of absolute retribution creates a kind of peace that is perhaps more genuine than that found in many legitimate establishments. Everyone understands the stakes, and everyone benefits from the system's continued operation.
In the world beyond the Continental's doors, power is measured in many currencies: money, information, influence, fear. But within the Shadow World itself, there exists a more tangible symbol of authority and respect: the gold coins that serve as the primary medium of exchange among professionals. These coins, unmarked by any government mint and bearing symbols that speak to initiates alone, represent something far more valuable than their material worth. Each coin is a work of art, crafted with the precision that befits its importance in the shadow economy. The gold is pure and heavy, satisfying to hold and impossible to counterfeit. But their true value lies not in their metal content, but in what they represent: a promise kept, a service rendered, a debt acknowledged. In a world where trust is often the difference between life and death, the coins serve as tangible proof that obligations will be honored and agreements will be kept. The coins circulate through a complex network of exchanges that would make conventional economists weep with envy for its efficiency. A single coin might purchase a weapon, pay for information, secure passage through dangerous territory, or buy silence from a witness. The exchange rate is not determined by markets or central banks, but by the intricate web of relationships that connects every member of the Shadow World. A coin offered by John Wick carries different weight than one tendered by an unknown freelancer, not because the metal is different, but because the reputation behind it adds value that cannot be measured in conventional terms. At the Continental, coins are exchanged with the ceremony of a religious ritual. The concierge, a man whose knowledge of the Shadow World's resources is encyclopedic, accepts payment with the gravity of a priest receiving offering. Each transaction is recorded not in ledgers but in memory, creating a vast mental database of debts and credits that spans the global network of professionals. The system requires absolute trust and perfect memory, qualities that are rare in the ordinary world but essential in the shadow realm. The coins also serve as a form of identification among professionals. The way a person handles them, the manner in which they are offered and accepted, the subtle protocols that govern their exchange, all of these reveal information about the bearer's experience, training, and standing within the community. A newcomer who fumbles with the coins or fails to observe proper etiquette immediately marks themselves as an outsider, while a master assassin's fluid handling of the currency announces their expertise to all who observe. New coins enter circulation through a process that is as mysterious as it is carefully controlled. They are not minted in factories or distributed by institutions, but appear through channels that connect the shadow world to legitimate sources of power and influence. Some say they are produced in secret facilities hidden beneath major cities. Others believe they are created by craftsmen who have inherited the knowledge from their predecessors, passing down the art of coin-making like a sacred trust. Among the Continental's most fascinating residents is a man known simply as the sommelier, though his expertise extends far beyond wine and spirit. His domain is a workshop hidden beneath the hotel's basement levels, a place where the tools of the assassin's trade are displayed with the same reverence that a museum might show ancient artifacts. Here, weapons are not merely instruments of death, but works of art, each one crafted with the precision and attention to detail that separates professionals from amateurs. The sommelier himself is a figure of quiet dignity,
a man who approaches his work with the same passion that others might bring to music or literature. He has spent decades studying the evolution of weapons technology, understanding not just how tools of death function, but how they reflect the personalities and preferences of those who wield them. His recommendations are sought after by assassins from around the world, who trust his judgment to provide them with instruments perfectly suited to their individual styles and needs. His workshop is organized like a fine wine cellar, with weapons categorized not just by type and caliber but by subtler qualities, their balance, their reliability, their aesthetic appeal. Handguns are arranged by country of origin and manufacturer, each one test-fired and evaluated for accuracy and ease of concealment. Rifles are sorted by range and stopping power, with detailed notes on their performance in various environmental conditions. Knives are displayed like jewelry, their blades gleaming under carefully positioned lights that highlight their craftsmanship. But the sommelier's true expertise lies not in the weapons themselves but in matching them to their user. He possesses an almost supernatural ability to assess an assassin's needs and preferences, taking into account not just their physical capabilities but their psychological makeup and professional requirement. A client seeking a weapon for close quarters work might be offered a compact pistol with exceptional stopping power, while someone planning a long-range elimination would be presented with a rifle capable of precision at extraordinary distance. The consultation process resembles a fitting at an exclusive tailor, with the sommelier asking detailed questions about the client's intended use and personal preferences. He observes how they handle different weapons, noting their natural stance and grip, their comfort level with various mechanisms and systems. The final recommendation represents not just technical expertise but genuine understanding of the human element that makes each assassin unique. Payment for the sommelier's services is always made in gold coins, but the transaction involves more than simple commerce. The exchange represents a relationship built on mutual respect and professional understanding. The sommelier takes pride in his work, viewing each successful assignment completed with one of his recommended weapons as validation of his expertise. Clients return not just because of his technical knowledge, but because of the trust that develops between craftsman and professional.
The Continental Hotel serves as more than just a refuge for individual assassins. It is the central hub of a vast network that spans the globe, connecting similar establishments in every major city. This network, known among insiders simply as the Continental, represents one of the world's most successful examples of international cooperation, operating with the efficiency that would make legitimate governments envious. Each Continental hotel maintains its own character while adhering to the same fundamental principles that govern the New York establishment. The Continental Rome occupies a palazzo that has housed secrets for centuries, its Renaissance architecture providing an elegant backdrop for modern intrigue. The Continental Tokyo operates from a building that seamlessly blends traditional Japanese design with cutting-edge security technology. The Continental Berlin sits in a structure that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, its walls holding memories of conflicts that shaped the modern world. Communication between these establishments flows through channels that are as secure as they are invisible to outside observers. Messages are encoded in languages that exist nowhere else, transmitted through methods that would perplex intelligence agencies. The network's information-sharing capabilities rival those of any government organization, allowing assassins to travel between cities with the confidence that their reputations and obligations will be recognized regardless of their location. This global reach creates opportunities for collaboration that would be impossible in more conventional criminal organizations. An assassin based in New York might receive support from colleagues in London, utilize resources provided by contacts in Hong Kong, and execute an assignment that was coordinated through the Continental's network. The system allows for a level of professional cooperation that transcends national boundaries and cultural differences. The network also serves as an early warning system, alerting members to threats and opportunities that might affect their operation. Information about law enforcement activities, changes in political situations, and shifts in the criminal landscape flows through the Continental's channels with remarkable speed. This intelligence network has prevented countless operations from ending in disaster and has allowed the shadow world to adapt to changing circumstances with remarkable resilience. But perhaps most importantly, the network serves as a repository for the shadow world's collective memory. Stories of legendary assassins,
Accounts of impossible assignments and lessons learned from both successes and failures are preserved and shared through the Continental's informal oral tradition. Young professionals learn not just techniques and tactics, but the deeper wisdom that comes from understanding the history and evolution of their chosen profession. Within the Shadow World's carefully structured hierarchy, there exists a group of individuals whose authority supersedes even that of the Continental's managers. Known as the High Table, these figures represent the oldest and most powerful criminal organizations on Earth, serving as both lawmakers and judges for the entire Shadow community. Their decisions carry the weight of absolute authority, and their judgment, once rendered, cannot be appealed or overturned. The High Table's members are shrouded in secrecy, their identities known only to a select few, and their meetings conducted in locations that are revealed only at the last moment. They represent not just criminal organizations, but entire criminal cultures, ancient syndicates that have survived wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empire. Their authority comes not from violence alone, but from their role as keepers of the traditions and customs that give the Shadow World its structure and purpose. When disputes arise that cannot be resolved through normal channels, when the Continental's rules are violated, or when conflicts threaten to destabilize the entire Shadow economy, the High Table intervenes with the weight of ultimate authority. Their agents, known as adjudicators, appear without warning to investigate problems and render judgment. These figures carry with them the power to restructure entire criminal organizations, to strip away authority from those who have abused it, and to impose sanctions that can destroy careers and end lives. The High Table's justice operates according to principles that are both ancient and pragmatic. They understand that the Shadow World's survival depends on maintaining certain standards of conduct and professionalism. Those who threaten these standards through reckless behavior, unnecessary violence, or violations of established protocol find themselves subject to consequences that are swift and final. The system works because everyone understands that the High Table's authority is absolute and their judgment is final. But the High Table's power extends beyond mere punishment to encompass the positive aspects of leadership as well. They serve as patrons for promising young assassins, providing training and resources to those who show exceptional potential. They mediate disputes between major criminal organizations, preventing conflicts that could destabilize entire regions. They also serve as the ultimate authority on questions of tradition and protocol, ensuring that the Shadow World's ancient customs are preserved and respected. The relationship between the High Table and individual assassins is complex and nuanced. While their authority is unquestioned, they generally prefer to govern through influence rather than direct control. Most professionals never interact directly with High Table representatives, instead learning of their decisions through the Continental's network. This distance creates an aura of mystery that enhances their authority while allowing them to operate with the flexibility that effective leadership requires.
The Shadow World is governed not just by formal rules, but by an elaborate system of rituals and customs that give meaning and structure to the professional assassin's life. These traditions, passed down through generations of practitioners, serve multiple purposes. They create bonds between professionals, they provide a framework for conducting business, and they maintain the cultural identity that separates the Shadow World from ordinary criminal enterprises. The most fundamental of these rituals is the marker system, a method of creating and acknowledging debts that goes far beyond simple financial obligations. When one professional assists another in a significant way, the recipient may offer a marker, a medallion that represents an unlimited obligation. The person who holds the marker can call upon the debt at any time, for any purpose, and the debtor is bound by honor and tradition to comply regardless of the personal cost. Markers are not offered lightly, as accepting one creates a vulnerability that can be exploited by enemies, but they also represent the highest form of trust that can exist between professionals, acknowledgement that the debt created is worth more than life itself. The marker system creates a web of obligations that connects assassins across the globe, ensuring that favors and assistance flow through the community according to ancient patterns of reciprocity. The rituals surrounding death are equally important, reflecting the Shadow World's complex relationship with mortality. When a respected professional dies, whether through violence or natural causes, their passing is marked by ceremonies that blend elements of religious observance
with practical consideration. The Continental's bar serves as an unofficial memorial hall, where colleagues gather to share stories and raise toasts to the deceased. These gatherings serve not just as mourning rituals, but as opportunities to assess the impact of the loss on ongoing operations, and to redistribute responsibilities among the surviving community members. Professional etiquette within the shadow world follows patterns that would be familiar to members of any exclusive club or profession, but with stakes that are considerably higher. The way weapons are presented and accepted, the protocols for entering and leaving the Continental's premises, the proper forms of address for different ranks and specializations. All of these details matter immensely in a community where misunderstandings can have fatal consequences. Training and mentorship follow traditional patterns that emphasize not just technical skills, but the cultural knowledge necessary to function effectively within the shadow world. Master assassins take on apprentices not just to pass on combat techniques, but to ensure that the community's values and traditions continue to the next generation. This system creates lineages of knowledge and skill that can be traced back through centuries of professional practice. Living within the shadow world's embrace comes with benefits that extend far beyond the obvious advantages of professional support and protection. Members of this exclusive community enjoy access to resources and services that would be impossible to obtain through conventional channels. Medical care from doctors who ask no questions, transportation that leaves no records, safe houses in every major city. These practical advantages make the dangerous life of a professional assassin not just possible, but surprisingly comfortable. But membership in this world also comes with costs that extend far beyond the gold coins that serve as currency. The most obvious price is the constant danger that comes with the profession itself. Even within the Continental's protected walls, assassins must remain alert to threats from rivals, law enforcement, and the possibility that their own past actions might return to haunt them. The luxury and elegance of the Continental cannot completely mask the reality that its guests are among the most dangerous people on Earth. Perhaps more significant is the psychological cost of living constantly outside the boundaries of conventional society. Professional assassins become skilled at maintaining facades, at creating and inhabiting false identities, at forming relationships that must always remain shallow enough to be abandoned at a moment's notice. The Continental provides a space where these masks can be lowered slightly, but even there, complete honesty and genuine intimacy remain dangerous luxuries. The shadow world's codes and traditions, while providing structure and meaning, also create constraints that can become increasingly burdensome over time. The obligation to honor markers regardless of personal cost, the requirement to maintain neutrality even when personal feelings suggest otherwise, the need to place professional obligations above personal desires. These demands can gradually erode an assassin's sense of individual agency and self-determination. Retirement from the shadow world is theoretically possible, but practically difficult. The skills and knowledge that make someone an effective assassin are not easily translated into conventional career. More importantly, the connections and obligations that bind members of the community together do not simply disappear when someone decides to leave the profession. Former assassins often find themselves drawn back into the world they tried to abandon, either through choice or necessity. The most profound cost may be the gradual erosion of normal human connections and experiences. The need for constant vigilance and deception makes it difficult to form genuine relationships with people outside the shadow world. Family connections become dangerous vulnerabilities that must be carefully managed or abandoned entirely. The simple pleasures of ordinary life, attending social gatherings, pursuing hobbies openly, forming romantic attachments, become complicated by the constant need to maintain operational security. As night settles over the Continental Hotel and its elegant rooms fill with guests whose true identities would astound the ordinary world, the eternal dance of the shadow world continues. In the lobby, assassins from different continents exchange polite conversation while mentally cataloging each other's strengths and weaknesses. At the bar, retired professionals share war stories with younger colleagues, who listen with the respect due to surviving masters of an ancient craft. The gold coins continue to change hands in transactions that would make no sense to outsiders, but represent the lifeblood of this hidden economy. Information flows through carefully constructed networks. Weapons are exchanged with the ceremony of religious artifacts, and debts are created and acknowledged according to protocols that have governed this world since before recorded history. Winston presides over it all from his office, a monarch of shadows, who understands that his authority depends on maintaining the delicate balance that keeps this world functioning. He knows the names and histories of every guest, understands the web of relationships and obligations that connects them, and works constantly to ensure that the Continental remains the neutral ground that makes their profession possible. The shadow world exists in the spaces between the ordinary world's perception and reality. In the gaps where conventional law and order cannot reach, it operates according to rules that are more ancient and in some ways more honorable than those that govern legitimate society. Its members may be killers, but they are killers who honor their debts, keep their promises, and maintain standards of professional conduct that would put many legitimate businesses to shame. This is the world that John Wick inhabits, the community that shaped him and continues to define his existence even when he tries to leave it behind. It is a world of deadly beauty and elegant violence, where courtesy and murder walk hand in hand, where loyalty and betrayal are separated by the thinnest of lines. It is a world that offers both sanctuary and danger, comfort and constant threat, belonging and eternal isolation. In the end, the Continental and the shadow world it represents offer something that the ordinary world cannot provide, a place where individuals who have chosen to live by violence can find community, purpose, and a form of civilization that accommodates their dangerous gift. It is not a perfect world, but it is a complete one, with its own culture, economy, and system of justice. And for those who find themselves unable to live within the boundaries of conventional society, it offers the only form of home they will ever know. The dance continues, eternal and elegant, deadly and beautiful, as the shadow world spins through its ancient patterns beneath the unseeing eyes of the ordinary world above. In the shadowy underworld of professional assassins, few names carried the weight of legend quite like John Wick. Known in whispers as Baba Yaga, the boogeyman that even boogeymen feared, his story begins not with violence, but with love. John had found something precious in a world built on death. A woman named Helen, who saw past the killer to the man beneath. Their love story was one of redemption and hope. Helen's presence in John's life offered him something he had never known: peace. She became his anchor to humanity, pulling him away from the blood-soaked world of the Continental Hotel and its network of assassins. For Helen, John did the impossible. He retired. The legendary hitman hung up his guns, traded his bulletproof suits for simple clothes, and learned to live a quiet life in their suburban home. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Helen fell ill, and despite John's desperate attempts to save her, cancer claimed the love of his life. In her final days, she arranged for one last gift to be delivered to John after her passing: a small beagle puppy named Daisy, along with a note that simply read, "So you don't have to grieve alone." Grief consumed John in ways that bullets and blades never could. The empty house echoed with memories, and only Daisy's presence offered any comfort. The puppy became his lifeline, a living connection to Helen's love and hope for his future. John began to heal, slowly learning to care for another living thing, finding purpose in the simple act of taking Daisy for walks and ensuring she was fed and happy. It was during one of these mundane trips, a visit to a gas station to fill up his 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429, that John's past came crashing back. Isef Tarasov, the bratty son of Russian mob boss Viggo Tarasov, spotted the classic muscle car and approached John with an offer to buy it. And John politely declined in Russian, revealing his fluency in the language. Yusef became intrigued and aggressive. That night, as John slept in his home, Yusef and his crew broke in. They struck John unconscious, killed Daisy and stole his car. When John awoke to find his puppy's lifeless body on the kitchen floor, something fundamental broke inside him. The careful walls he had built around his grief crumbled, and beneath them lay the cold, calculating killer that had made him a legend. The criminal underworld operates by unspoken rules and ancient codes. When Viggo Tarasov learned what his son had done, not just the theft and murder, but the identity of their victim, he knew the scope of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. In a desperate attempt to explain the magnitude of Yusef's mistake, Viggo told his son the truth about John Wick. John wasn't just any retired assassin. He was the man you sent to kill the boogeyman. Years ago, when John wanted to retire to marry Helen, Viggo had given him an impossible task: kill all of his enemies in a single night. Most men would have died attempting such a feat, but John succeeded, leaving a trail of bodies that cemented his reputation forever. The criminal underworld let him walk away because his demonstration of power was so absolute that forcing him to stay would have been suicide. Now, with Helen gone and his last connection to peace murdered, John descended into his basement and opened a concrete floor hiding place that hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside lay his tools of the trade: perfectly maintained guns, ammunition, gold coins bearing the symbol of the Continental Hotel, and his black suit, the uniform of death itself. The Continental Hotel stood as neutral ground in the world of assassins, a sanctuary where no business could be conducted on the premises. Winston, the hotel's manager, greeted John's return with the weary acknowledgement of someone who had hoped never to see him again in a professional capacity. The hotel's concierge, Chiron, provided John with the tools he would need: weapons, ammunition, and information. John's preparation was methodical and precise. Every weapon was tested, every bullet counted. He wasn't just planning an assault, he was orchestrating a symphony of destruction. The gold coins he carried weren't just currency. They were symbols of debts owed and services rendered in a world where professional courtesy was enforced by the threat of death.
John's first major assault took him to the Red Circle, a Russian nightclub that served as one of Viggo's strongholds. The attack was not random violence, but a carefully calculated strike designed to draw out his true target. John moved through the club like a force of nature, his every movement economical and lethal. The bathhouse sequence became legendary among those who witnessed it. John fought with a combination of martial arts, tactical shooting, and improvised weapons that transformed everyday objects into instruments of death. Each kill was purposeful, each movement bringing him closer to Yusef, while sending a message to Viggo: nowhere was safe. The criminal underworld watched in fascination and terror as John systematically dismantled Viggo's operation. This wasn't the work of an angry man seeking simple revenge. This was an artist returning to his craft, and his canvas was painted in blood. As bodies piled up and Viggo's empire crumbled, the Russian mob boss was forced to confront the reality of what he faced. John Wick wasn't just angry, he was methodical, unstoppable, and utterly committed to his course of action. The impossible task that had secured John's retirement years ago paled in comparison to the focused destruction he now unleashed. Viggo's attempts to negotiate, to offer compensation or alternatives, fell on deaf ears. John had been pulled back into a world he had left behind, and the only currency he now accepted was blood. The systematic destruction of the Tarasov organization became a masterclass in tactical assassination, each strike calculated to maximize psychological impact while advancing toward the ultimate goal. In this world of killers, few relationships transcended professional courtesy. Marcus, an older assassin who had served as something of a mentor to John, found himself caught between loyalty and survival when Viggo placed a substantial bounty on John's head. The Continental's neutral ground policy meant nothing outside its walls, and every assassin in the city became a potential threat. Marcus made his choice:
ultimately siding with John despite the financial incentive to do otherwise. His death at Vigo's hands served as both a personal loss for John and a reminder that in this world, loyalty was often repaid with betrayal, and friendship was a luxury few could afford. The final confrontation with Oyosef took place in a church, the sacred space providing no sanctuary for the young Russian. John's pursuit had been relentless, cutting through waves of bodyguards and security measures with surgical precision. When he finally faced Helen's killer, there were no dramatic speeches or prolonged torture, just swift, final justice. Oyosef's death should have ended the story, but in John's world, violence begets violence, and every action carries consequences that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Vigo Tarasov's final gambit was personal, a one-on-one confrontation at the docks, where he attempted to kill John himself. The older Russian was skilled and desperate, but he faced an opponent who had transcended normal human limitations through grief and rage, transformed into cold purpose. Their fight was brutal and personal, two men who understood each other's capability engaging in combat that was as much philosophical as physical. When John finally stood over Vigo's body, the immediate threat was ended, but the foundations for future conflicts had already been laid. The Continental's rules existed for a reason, and their violation carried severe consequences. Miss Perkins, a fellow assassin who had attempted to kill John within the hotel's sanctuary, learned this lesson in the most final way possible. Winston's enforcement of the hotel's neutrality served as a reminder that in this world, some rules were absolute, and their violation meant death regardless of one's skill or reputation. The new beginning. As the first chapter of John's return to the underworld closed, he found himself at an animal shelter, looking at the dogs waiting for homes. His choice of a pit bull, strong, loyal, and misunderstood, reflected his own position in the world. He had avenged Helen and Daisy, but in doing so, he had announced his return to a world that would never again let him rest. John's actions had consequences that extended far beyond the Russian mob. The High Table, the shadowy council that governed the international community of assassins, took notice of the chaos he had unleashed. His violation of continental rules, his systematic destruction of an entire criminal organization, and his very public return to active duty sent ripples throughout the global network of killers. The markers, blood oaths that bound assassins to unbreakable debts, became central to John's continuing story. Santino D'Antonio arrived with a marker John had given him years ago, the debt that had originally allowed John to complete his impossible task and retire. The irony was bitter. The very tool that had bought John his freedom would now drag him back into the darkness. Santino's request seemed simple on the surface: kill his sister Gianna, so he could claim her seat at the High Table. But John understood that accepting this contract would mean betraying everything he had tried to build with Helen. Refusing it, however, would mean breaking the most sacred rule of their world. A marker must be honored. The destruction of John's house, Santino's response to his initial refusal, eliminated any possibility of returning to his quiet life. With nowhere else to turn, John was forced to accept the contract, knowing it would lead him deeper into a web of obligations and violence from which there might be no escape. The Roman Continental, managed by Julius, operated under the same rules as its New York counterpart, but with an old-world elegance that reflected the ancient nature of their profession. John's preparation for the assault on Gianna D'Antonio was elaborate and precise, involving custom weapons, tactical analysis, and the kind of detailed planning that had made him legendary. The catacombs beneath Rome became the stage for one of John's most challenging battles. Fighting through waves of assassins in the narrow underground passages, he demonstrated the tactical adaptability that set him apart from other killers. Every corner could hide an enemy, every shadow could conceal death. But John moved through the ancient tunnels with the confidence of someone who had made darkness his ally. Gianna D'Antonio's death was not a murder, but a suicide. Her choice to end her life on her own terms rather than at John's hands. This act of defiance created complications that Santino hadn't anticipated, and added layers of moral complexity to John's already troubled conscience. He had fulfilled the letter of his contract, while being denied the clean completion he had sought. The subsequent battle in the Hall of Mirrors became a philosophical as well as physical confrontation. Reflections multiplied infinitely, creating a maze where reality and illusion blurred together. John's victory came not through superior firepower, but through understanding the nature of the environment and using it to his advantage. Cassian, Gianna's bodyguard, represented a different kind of challenge for John. Their confrontation in the museum was less about hatred and more about professional obligation. Cassian sought revenge not out of personal animosity, but because his failure to protect Gianna demanded it. Their fight through the museum's exhibits became a dance of death among artifacts of human history, violence playing out against the backdrop of civilization's greatest achievements. The subway chase that followed demonstrated both men's skills in urban combat. Moving through crowded public spaces while engaged in lethal combat required a level of control and precision that few possessed. Their mutual respect, evident even as they tried to kill each other, spoke to the complex relationships that existed within their profession. Santino's betrayal, placing a bounty on John's head immediately after the completion of their contract, was both predictable and unforgivable. The criminal underworld's response was swift and overwhelming. Every assassin in New York began hunting for John, transforming the city into a battlefield where he was outnumbered but never outclassed. The subway fight with the massive assassin who wielded pencils as weapons became legendary. John's improvisation and adaptability were on full display as he transformed everyday objects into lethal instruments. The fight's brutal efficiency and dark humor epitomized the unique tone of John's world, where death was always present but never entirely divorced from a certain twisted artistry. Returning to the Continental, John found temporary sanctuary. But he also discovered that the rules that had once protected him were becoming constraints. Winston's position as manager required him to maintain neutrality even as his personal sympathy lay with John. The hotel's Baroque social structure, with its formal courtesy masking deadly intent, created an atmosphere of constant tension. The arrival of other assassins seeking the bounty on John's head transformed the Continental into a pressure cooker. Every conversation was a potential threat assessment. Every friendly gesture could hide lethal intent. John's ability to navigate this social minefield while maintaining his own integrity became as important as his combat skill. Ares, Santino's mute assassin, represented a different kind of challenge. Her communication through sign language and her use of modified weapons created encounters that were both intimate and deadly. The absence of verbal taunting or threats made their confrontations feel more pure, violence distilled to its essential elements without the distraction of words. Their final confrontation in Santino's museum demonstrated John's ability to adapt to opponents who fought outside conventional parameters. Ares's death was both a tactical victory and a personal tragedy. Another skilled professional eliminated not out of hatred, but because the structure of their world demanded it. John's decision to kill Santino within the Continental Sanctuary was both inevitable and catastrophic. The immediate threat Santino posed, combined with the impossibility of finding justice through conventional means, left John with no alternative. But the violation of the hotel's neutrality carried consequences that would reshape his entire world. Winston's reaction, the formal revocation of John's membership and the 1-hour head start before every assassin in the world would be hunting him, was both merciful and merciless. The personal friendship between John and Winston made the necessary punishment even more painful, but the rules that governed their world were absolute. The excommunication transformed John from a respected member of the assassin community into its most wanted target. The global nature of the High Table's reach meant that nowhere in the world was truly safe. Every Continental hotel, every manager, every assassin who had once shown him professional courtesy was now obligated to kill him on sight. The systematic destruction of John's support network, his accounts frozen, his safe houses compromised, his allies turned against him, demonstrated the High Table's power and reach. In declaring war on the established order, John had chosen the most difficult possible path, but it was the only one that allowed him to maintain his integrity. The Bowery King represented the criminal underworld that existed parallel to but separate from the High Table's domain. His network of homeless informants and his willingness to challenge established authority made him a natural ally for John's rebellion. Their partnership was built on mutual respect and shared opposition to overwhelming power rather than personal friendship. The weapons and intelligence the Bowery King provided were crucial to John's survival, but they came with the understanding that this alliance was temporary and tactical. Both men understood that their cooperation was born of necessity rather than trust, and that circumstances could easily make them enemies again.
John's journey to find the Elder, the mythical figure who sat above even the high table, took him to the edges of the civilized world. The Moroccan desert became both a physical and spiritual testing ground, where John was forced to confront the fundamental questions about who he was and what he was willing to sacrifice. The trials imposed by the Elder, including the loss of his ring finger and wedding ring, were designed to test John's commitment to survival versus his attachment to his past. The symbolic nature of these sacrifices spoke to the spiritual dimensions of John's journey, transforming what had begun as simple revenge into something approaching a quest for redemption. Sophia Al-Azwar represented John's past relationships and the prices paid for life in their profession. Her exile to Casablanca, her management of the Moroccan Continental, and her partnership with her combat-trained dogs all reflected different aspects of the choices that defined their world. Their assault on the fortress to reach Barada became a masterclass in coordinated combat. Sophia's tactical skills, combined with her dog's training and John's adaptability, created a fighting force that was both unconventional and devastatingly effective. The sequence demonstrated how personal relationships could be maintained even within the constraints of their violent profession. The High Table's response to John's rebellion was swift and comprehensive. The adjudicator's arrival in New York began a systematic purge of anyone who had aided or supported John, while Zero's team of skilled assassins represented the table's most elite enforcer. Zero's admiration for John created a complex dynamic, where professional obligation warred with personal respect. Their confrontations became as much about testing skills and philosophies as about completing assignment. Zero's death was both a victory for John and a loss of someone who truly understood the artistry of their profession. The High Table's siege of the Continental Hotel transformed the sanctuary into a battlefield. Winston's decision to support John, even at the cost of his own position, demonstrated that some loyalties transcended institutional obligation. The hotel's transformation from neutral ground into a fortress created a new kind of combat environment, where every room became a potential trap or escape route. The coordinated defense mounted by the Continental staff showcased the military precision that underlay their hospitality. Concierges became tacticians, housekeepers became weapon specialists, and the hotel's elegant facade concealed deadly efficiency. The battle demonstrated that the Continental's neutrality had always been backed by the threat of overwhelming force. The assault by Zero's students in the glass house created a combat environment where concealment was impossible and every movement was exposed. John's ability to use the transparent environment to his advantage while defending against multiple skilled opponents demonstrated his tactical superiority and adaptability. The philosophical discussions that took place even during combat reflected the deeper themes of honor, duty, and personal choice that ran throughout John's story. These were not mindless killers, but thoughtful professionals grappling with the moral implications of their choices, while still fulfilling their obligation. Betrayal and forgiveness. Winston's apparent betrayal, shooting John off the Continental's roof, seemed to represent the final dissolution of personal relationships in favor of institutional loyalty. But the revelation that John had survived, along with Winston's subtle assistance in that survival, demonstrated the complex calculations that governed behavior in their world. The cyclical nature of loyalty and betrayal reflected the unstable foundations of any society built on violence. Trust was always conditional, alliances were always temporary, and survival often depended on the ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. John's survival and continued resistance represented more than personal vendetta. They had become symbols of rebellion against an established order that many found oppressive. His willingness to stand against impossible odds inspired others to question their own relationships with power and authority. The transformation from legendary assassin to revolutionary leader was neither planned nor welcomed by John himself. But the logic of his situation
made it inevitable that his personal struggle would become part of a larger conflict about power, justice, and the right to self-determination. Throughout his journey, John's approach to combat maintained an almost artistic quality. Each confrontation was choreographed with precise timing, efficient movement, and an understanding of space and momentum that transformed violence into something approaching dance. This aesthetic dimension of John's violence served multiple purposes within the narrative. It elevated the action beyond simple brutality, created visual poetry from destruction, and reflected the deeper themes about the relationship between beauty and death that ran throughout the story. The precision and efficiency of John's methods also reinforced his legendary status within the criminal underworld. These were not the desperate struggles of an amateur but the calculated performances of a master craftsman working at the height of his ability. John Wick's story became more than entertainment. It became a modern mythology about the prices of violence, the possibility of redemption, and the eternal struggle between individual conscience and institutional power. The character's journey from grief-stricken widower to revolutionary leader resonated with audiences because it addressed fundamental questions about justice, loyalty, and the possibility of change. The world-building that surrounded John's personal story created a rich tapestry of interconnected characters, institutions, and conflicts that could support multiple narratives. Each supporting character carried their own complete backstory, their own motivations, and their own relationships with the central themes of the series. The ongoing nature of John's struggle, his inability to find permanent peace or resolution, reflected the reality that some conflicts are not meant to be definitively won but rather to be continuously navigated. His story became one of endurance rather than victory, of maintaining integrity rather than achieving dominance. In the end, John Wick's tale serves as both thrilling entertainment and thoughtful meditation on the nature of violence, justice, and human connection in a world where traditional moral frameworks have broken down. His journey from the suburbs to the criminal underworld and beyond represents not just one man's quest for vengeance, but a larger exploration of what it means to maintain humanity in an inhumane world. The legend of John Wick continues to grow, not because his story has ended, but because it represents timeless themes that each generation must confront anew. In a world where traditional authorities have failed and individual action becomes necessary, John's example, however violent, offers a framework for understanding how personal integrity can be maintained even under the most extreme circumstance. And so the story continues, each chapter building upon the last, each confrontation revealing new depths to both the character and the world he inhabits. John Wick remains as he began a figure caught between worlds, too human for the criminal underworld, too violent for the legitimate world, but too compelling to be forgotten by either. Rest well, and may your dreams be filled with the ballet of precise movement and the poetry of perfect technique, where every action has meaning and every gesture carries the weight of legend.